You are welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Salami Titilopadini, and the topic before us today is mapping and function. So I will just be telling you what you need to know under the mapping and function. What you need to know, the first thing is we need to know that function is denoted by f of x to y. That means there must be a linkage between x and y. And what is your x? Your x simply stands for what? For the domain. And what is your y? Your y simply stands for what? For the codomain. And when we are talking of the domain, what is the meaning of domain? Domain simply means what? Input variable. And what is the meaning of codomain? Codomain means what? The output variable. And what is the summary to this? The summary to this is this. Let's assume we have x and let's assume we have y. That means our x is the input variable, and that makes it to be what? To be the domain. And your y is the output variable, and that makes it to be what? The codomain. Now this x will also have some elements inside it. That means x is an element of what? Of the codomain. And this your y also will have an element inside it, and that will give us what? Y is an element of what? Of the codomain. And this man is standing alone. That does not make them to be mapping and function. So there is a mapping when there is a relationship linking your x and your y together. So basically under mapping and function, we need to know the definition of terms. And the first man is what? Is the domain. And the second man is what? Is the codomain. Your domain is what? Is the input variable. Your codomain is what? Is the output variable. Now let's look at these examples again. We have A, B, C, and let's assume we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now just to buttress more points under the definition of terms. Now we can see here that our x is our domain. And what is your y? Your y is the codomain. That means the element in x is what? Is A, B, and what? And C. That means A, B, and C belongs to the domain. And what is your y? Your y is the codomain, and that will give us what? 1, 2, 3, 4, and what? And 5. Now we have looked at the domain, we have looked at the meaning for what? For the codomain. Now let us now explain the meaning of the range, or what we term as what? As the image. So when we are talking of the range or the image, you need to know that your range or the image are the favorable outcome in the codomain. That means the favorable outcome in the codomain here will give us 1, 2, and what? And 4. So for this type of mapping, your range is 1, 2, and what? And 4. So that means your range or your image is what? Is 1, 2, and 4. Don't forget, your range or your image are the favorable outcome in your codomain. Now we need to know the meaning of what? Of inverse. They can ask you to find the inverse of a function. Now the inverse of a function also can be gotten graphically by saying inverse is still the same thing as what we term as what? As the pre-image. And when we are talking of the inverse or the pre-image, what is the meaning? Inverse or the pre-image is talking about the favorable outcome in the domain. The range is the favorable outcome in the codomain, while your inverse or your pre-image is the favorable outcome in the domain. So what is your favorable outcome here? That means your inverse or your pre-image will give us what? A, B, and C. And those are the definition of terms: the domain, the codomain, the inverse, image, and the range. Now let's look at this. They said if the domain of the function f of t is equals to t squared plus 2t plus 1. They say we should find the range at t is equals to 1, at t is equals to 2, and at t is equals to 3. So what is the meaning? We have talked about it. Your domain is the input variable. That means we have it as what? 1, 2, 3. That is your domain. And that means we need to get our output variable, which is what? Your codomain. So what is your codomain? That means if your t is 1, what do we have? 1 squared plus 2 times 1 plus 1. And that will give us 1 plus 2 plus 2. Sorry, plus 1. and that means your output variable will give us 4. That means here we are going to have for 1 will be linked with 4. And if your input variable is 2, what is your output variable? That will give us 2 squared plus 2 times 2. That will give us 4 plus 1. And that will give us what? 9. That means if your input variable is 2, your output variable is 9. So if your input variable is 3, what is your output variable? 3 squared is 9. Plus 2 times 3 will give us what? 6 plus 1. And that will give us what? 16. That means your output variable is 16. The input variable and your output variable. And that is what? That is the graphical what? Notation. And if they are asking us to find the range, what is your range? Your range is what? 4, 9, and 16. You can see that it's very, very simple. Now let's now look at a question that is not talking of the domain, but they are going to give us the range to find the domain. Now they say if f of x is equals to x minus 2, they said find the domain of the function given the range to be 4, 5, and 6. So let's look at this. How can we solve? That means our range is what? Is the output variable, which is 4, 5, 6. And what is your output variable? Your output variable is f of x. That means if f of x is 4, what will be your input variable? Your x will give us 6. And if f of x is equals to 5, what is your input variable? Your x will give us 7. And if your f of x is 6, what is your input variable? That will give us what? X is equals to 8. So that means our domain is what? Is 6, 7, and 8, because they are the input variable. And if you want to draw it graphically, we have 6, 7, and 8 to be the input variable. And what will be your output variable? 4, 5, and 6. And we have it like this. And that is all for that. Now let's now look at a question again that is linking range, domain, codomain, inverse, and all together. Now we have a question like this. They say if x is equals to x is an element of z. And what is the meaning of z? Z simply means what? An integer. Now they said minus 1 lesser than or equals to 2. And we have our y, which is the output variable, to be x is an element of z. We have it as what? Minus 3 to y, and then to 3. Now from this, they said we should find 1, the domain. They said 2, we should find the codomain. They said 3, we should find the image or the range. And lastly, they said we should find the inverse image. So let's look at this. How can we solve? Now from this, what is your domain? Your domain is the input variable. And what are your input variable? Your input variable means what? X is an element of integer, and it varies between this and this. So that means your domain will give us what? Minus 1, 0, 1, 2. Do we get that? Minus 1, 0, 1, and 2. And what is your codomain? Your codomain are what? Your output variable. And that will give us what? Minus 3, minus 2, minus 1, 0, 1, 2, and 3. Now, for this question, let us look at the relationship between them. They say if f of x is equals to x plus 4. Now, let's look at this. They say x plus 4 is wide. Let's look at x minus 1. They say if f of x is equals to x minus 1. Now, what are we trying to say? Let us look at it graphically. Your domain function will give us minus 1, 0, 1, and 2. And what is your codomain function? Your codomain function will give us the larger numbers, and that will give us what? Minus 3, minus 2, minus 1, 0, 1, 2, and 3. Now for this is your domain, and this is your codomain. There is no relationship between them. Now for there to be a relationship, what are we going to do? That means if your x is minus 1, insert it here. Minus 1 will give us minus 2. That means if the input variable is minus 1, your output variable will give us what? Minus 2. 0 minus 1 will give us minus 1. That will go to this, that will go to this, and that will go to this. And we have explained a lot of things under mapping and function. Your domain function are the elements of your domain. Your codomain is what the element in your codomain. Now we are looking for the image or the range. What is our image or the range here? We have said it. Your image or the range are the favorable outcome in what? In your codomain. And what are the favorable outcomes here? That will give us minus 2, minus 1, 0, and 1. And we have talked about it. What is the meaning of inverse image? Inverse image is talking of what? Of the pre-image. And those are what the favorable outcome in what? In the domain. So reversing it back now, what are the favorable outcome in the domain? We have it as what? Minus 1, 0, 1, and what? And 2. And that is the summary of the definition of terms. So I believe now we can now understand the meaning of what? The domain, the meaning of codomain, the meaning of the image or the range, and the meaning of what? Of the inverse image. Now we want to look at inverse as a case study. Now we want to look at inverse when we are not talking of graphical. When we are talking of what? Of algebraic expression. So now, for you to get your inverse, you have to know that your inverse means what? Y back to what? To x. Your f of x is x to y. While your inverse is what? Is y back to x. So how can you get your inverse? There are some conditions we have to know. And what are the conditions to get your inverse? We have some steps for getting inverse of a function. And what are the steps? The first one is this. We are to change our f of x back to y. After changing your f of x back to y, you interchange. You interchange your x and y. And what is the meaning of interchanging your x and y? You change your y to x, you change your x to y. And after interchanging, you will now make your new y the subject of the formula. And after making your new y the subject of the formula, we should now know that your new y is now the inverse of the function. It's simple. Make your f of x to be equals to y, interchange your x and y, make y the subject of the formula, and your new y is what? Is the inverse of the function. Now let's assume we have f of x to be 3x minus 1. They said we should find the inverse of this function. So how can we find? The first step says change your f of x to y, and after that you interchange. So let us interchange. What do we have? We have x is equals to 3y minus 1, and make your y the subject of the formula. That means your y will give us x plus 1 over 3. That means the inverse of the function will now give us what? X plus 1 over 3. And it's simple. Now let's look at more example on this, how to get the inverse of a function. Now let us look at this. They say if f of x is equals to x minus 2 over x plus 2, they said we should find the inverse of the function. So how can we get the inverse of the function? The same process. Change this man to y. That will give us y minus 2 over what? Over x plus 2. And interchange. So if you interchange this, what do we have? We have it as x is equals to y minus 2 over y plus 2. That means when you are interchanging, you change your y to x, you change your y to x, and you change your x to y. So, and now we are not going to make our y the subject of the formula. So cross multiply. What do we have? Xy plus 2x. If x multiply this, we have this. So correct like times y minus xy is equals to 2x plus 2. And make your y the subject of the formula. We have it as what? 1 minus x is equals to what? 2x plus 2. And what do we have? Y is equals to 2x plus 2 over what? Over 1 minus x. And that means your inverse of the function is 2x plus 2 over 1 minus x. So it's simple. Now, not to waste time, let's look at this last question under the inverse, and then we try to take it to the types of function when we will release the second video. Now let's look at this. We have if f of x is equals to x squared over x squared minus 2. They said we should find the inverse of the function. So how can we get the inverse of the function? You change your f of x to y. That will give us y is equals to x squared over what? Over x squared minus 2. And we are now going to interchange. So if you interchange, what do we have? That will give us x is equals to y squared over what? Y squared minus 2. And now try to make your y the subject of the formula. First multiply. That will give us y squared is equals to what? Xy squared minus what? Minus 2x. Collect like times. That will give us xy squared minus y squared is equals to what? 2x. So what is common? Y squared. What do we have? X minus 1 is equals to what? 2x. That means your y squared will give us what? Will give us 2x over what? Over x minus 1. And what is your y? Your y will give us plus or minus the square root of what? Of 2x over x minus 1. And that your new y is now the inverse of the function. And that is how to get the inverse. To get the domain and the range when we are not having the input and the output variable. Now we have to know that your domain is gotten from the question, while your range will be gotten from what? The inverse of the function. And under this aspect is so crucial in the sense that we have something we term as what? As conditions of your domain and your range. And when we are talking of the conditions of your domain and your range, we have three types of condition. The first one is when we have no denominator. And what are we saying when we are not having any denominator? For instance, let's assume you are solving and they gave you this. That means your domain is what? Is real. Do we get that? The meaning of domain and your range is, are we going to have real number for all questions? That's the meaning. So that means your domain here is always real. No matter the value of x you are putting here, you will always have a real value. And now we have another conclusion that we term as what? As a denominator conclusion. That is when we are having something like x minus 1 over x plus 1. It will always be real, excluding a stage that we call what? Undefined. So that means this will always be real, excluding when you are equating this man to 0. And also we have the third conclusion, and the third conclusion is when you are having what? A square root. So now this is the we have three conditions: the non-denominator, the denominator, and what? And the square root. And that is where the first video will stop. Let's just look at a few questions under it and then we end the first video. Now they said find the domain and the range of f of x is equals to x minus 1. So how can we get this? We have said it that your domain function is always from the question. Yours is just to conclude whether it is real or not. So for this, it is under what? The non-denominator. That means your domain function will always be real. So how can you get your range? That means your range will be gotten from the inverse of the function. And how can we get the inverse of the function? Don't forget, change this man to y. And after that, you interchange them. And after that, you make your y the subject of the formula. And your new y will give us what? Will give us the inverse of what? Of the function. And you can see this also ended up at what? At a non-denominator. That means your range also will be what? Be real. So it's simple. Your domain function is real. Your range function is what? Is also real. Now let's change the function. Let's change the function to f of x is equals to 3x plus 2. So for this also, what is your domain function? Your domain function from this is not having any denominator nor square root. That means your domain function is real. And how can you get your range? You have to get your range from the inverse of the function. So get the inverse of the function, change this to y. We have it as y is equals to this, and then interchange. x is equal to 3y plus 2. Make your y the subject of the formula, and that will give us y is equal to x minus 2 over 3. And this is what is now your inverse of the function. And you can see it is also having non-denominator. And what is your range? Your range or your image will also be what? Be real. And now let us look at the next question. Just for us to understand the three types of condition, we have if they say we have f of x is equal to x minus 1 over x plus 1. Now you can see this is having what? A denominator. That means if you want to conclude for the domain function will always be real, excluding when we are equating the denominator to 0. So if you equate this to 0, your x will give us what? Minus 1. That means your domain function will be real, excluding when your x is what? Is minus 1. It's simple. And how can you get your range? Don't forget, you cannot get your range from the question. You have to get the inverse of the function. So getting the inverse of the function, change your f of x to y. That will give us y is equal to 1x minus 1 into what? Into x plus 1. And you interchange, that will give us x is equal to y minus 1 over what? Y plus 1. And make your y the subject of the formula, xy plus what? Plus x. So collect like times, that will give us y minus xy is equal to x plus 1. Your y is common, 1 minus x is equal to what? X plus y. That means your y is what? Is x plus 1 over 1 minus x. And this also is what? Is the inverse of the function. And since we have gotten the inverse of the function, and we know that your range also will be gotten from the conclusion of your inverse, that means your range will be real, excluding when you are equating this man to 0. So if you equate this man to 0, it will exclude 1. Simple. And now let's look at the last aspect of it. And that is where we are now going to have what? A square root. For instance, they said of f of x is equal to x squared over x squared minus 1. So how can we solve this? That means your domain function, your domain is being gotten from the question. That means for this, it is having what? A denominator. That means your domain will be real, excluding when you are equating your denominator to 0. So if you equate this to 0, that will give us x squared is equal to 1. Your x will give us plus or minus 1. That means your domain is real, excluding when your x is what? Is plus or minus 1. That means if you put your x to be plus or minus 1 here, it will give us a complex number. So that means your domain will always be real, excluding when your x is what? Is plus or minus 1. Now, how can we get our range? Our range conclusion, we have to get the inverse of the function. So what are the steps for getting the inverse of the function? You change this one to y, and that will give us over what? X squared minus 1. You interchange. X is equal to y squared over what? Y squared minus 1. Make your y the subject of the formula, and that will give us this. Collect like times, that will give us y squared minus y squared is equal to x. That will give us y squared into what? Into x minus 1 is equal to x. That will give us y squared is equal to what? X over x minus 1. And from that, we can now conclude that our y will now be what? Will now be the inverse of the function. And that is plus or minus the square root of x minus 1. And when we are now having the square root of x minus 1, that will take us to the third conclusion. And for the third conclusion, this is how we judge it. Your domain function will be real, but it will not exclude. It will now include when you are equating any function inside the square root to be greater than or equals to 0. Do we get that? We have three types of conclusion. The first one is non-denominator. It is always real. The second one is when we are having denominator. It is always real, excluding when you are equating your denominator to 0. The third one is when we are having a square root. It is real, and it now includes the values when you are equating the function inside the square root to be greater than or equals to 0. And as we all know, this is what is inequality. We cannot leave it like this. And how will you solve? You multiply through by the square of the linear, and that will give us x into what? Into x minus 1 greater than or equals to 0. And we are still going to look at inequality. Your value of x is 0 and 1, and we have a shortcut. Yours is just to write 0, put the sign inside them, and we have it as this. But we have to know that greater than is not stable. This is not the final answer. We have to separate it. That means your x is lesser than or equals to 0, and your x is what? Is greater than or equals to 0. So that means for your range conclusion now, how can we conclude for your range? Your range is real, and it includes values between what? X lesser than or equals to 0, and x greater than or equals to 1. And that is where we are going to put an end to it for today. We have looked at mapping a function. We have looked at what is the meaning of a function. We have looked at the meaning of what? Of the domain, the codomain, the range, the image itself, the pre-image, the same thing as what? As the inverse, or what? The inverse image. We have looked at how to get the inverse function. We have looked at how to get your range or your domain when we are not having the input nor the output variable. I remain my humble self, Salami Titi Dr. Adeni. Don't forget to like, don't forget to share, and please don't forget to subscribe.